All right, thank you so much. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining my session today. My name is Zainab Daodu. I'm a technical writer, also the founder of Write Tech Hub, an organization that provides technical content creation services to organizations. We were formerly Zcodes, and we are in the process of rebranding, and I'm also an open source programs manager. I create open source programs for nonprofits, majorly to get women in tech and to improve diversity in the open source ecosystem. So today, based on everything I've said, I'm going to be talking about open source development with focusing on accessible documentation and how this can improve our open source ecosystem. So for this session, we're going to be talking about what accessible documentation is, why it matters, who it benefits, common challenges, why is it so hard for open source organizations and communities to have accessible documentation, the characteristics, how to overcome the difficulties, and then a few success stories. So let's jump right into it. What is accessible documentation? Accessible documentation is basically guides, instructions, documents, any kind of document that is easy for people of diverse backgrounds, and with different abilities to be able to access. And during this talk, I'm going to be talking about the different people we're trying to be able to reach with this accessible documentation. It basically involves, putting in practices to be able to ensure that your document is able to reach everybody. And why does accessible documentation matter in open source? It's not just to benefit the users, but there are a lot of benefits. One of it is inclusivity and diversity. So when we talk about inclusive and diverse communities, it's not just about having, gender diversity. There are different types of diversities. And, having a diverse community is being able to reach people across all over the world with different abilities, and not just, gender, people who have, disabilities, people who are not able to access just your regular type of content. And also another benefit is, you have a broad range of users when you have accessible content. People, from all walks of life are able to use your content, and they're able to give you feedback. You are also able to improve user experience. I think this is self-explanatory. And then compliance to legal requirements and standards. So open source projects will greatly benefit from using guidelines like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these guidelines provide like frameworks for you to be able to create accessible product documentation, product guidelines, and different content. And right now we have laws, we even have laws like the European Accessibility Act that use these frameworks to ensure that open source organizations or communities are adhering to the different standards. And then outside of, having a diverse community, most of the characteristics that we have to be able to create accessible documentation also intertwine with the characteristics for you to be able to improve SEO. For instance, having clear and concise content, having all text in your images and things like that. It helps to also improve SEO. So when you have a focus on accessible documentation or accessibility when you're creating your documentation, you also benefit from your content ranking top in search results due to all these characteristics. And for us to be able to really understand accessible documentation and be able to create documentation, you need to understand who are the people you're trying to reach, who are these people, who are the different people. And the people I'm focusing on for this talk are people with blindness and low vision. These people are not necessarily able to read your text, or they are not able to read text with color contrasts that are not good. We have people with hearing loss. If you have content that is only, that can only be accessed by watching it, by listening to audio or things like that, you lose out on this kind of people. You also have people with limited movement who would be accessing content using different input devices. Maybe they are not able to use a mouse, they only use keyboards to access your content and things like that. So you need to keep this in mind when you're working on your documentation or designing your content. What if someone is just using a keyboard? Can they be able to interact with this content like every other person would? And then you have neurological limitations. These affect, concentration, focus. People have difficulty in concentrating and focusing. And then when you have content that is not clear or concise, such people are not even able to utilize the content because of all these difficulties. We have cognitive limitations. These are people with disabilities like dyslexia, who find it hard to or difficult to understand your content, especially when it is disorganized, when it is not arranged. And then temporary or situational impairments. Maybe you're outside in a busy environment, you're not able to use your laptop, you're accessing it on a mobile. Is documentation accessible with all these formats? And then looking at all these people, what are the different challenges that they have when they're accessing documentation? And some of them include missing or inaccurate text alternatives for images. So when you have images in your document, yes, it's part of the guidelines for creating good documentation is having visuals where necessary to explain. But then for you to have visuals in your documentation, there are guidelines that you need to put in place to make sure that your document is accessible, and then the visuals is not doing more harm than good to your documentation. So the first is alt text. So imagine someone is using a screen reader, and then you just have your image without any alternate text to explain what the image is. Person using the screen reader will probably not be able to pick up that image or understand what the image is doing there. So you need to include alternative text. Insufficient color contrast is also an issue that people experience. So for instance, using a bright colored text on a bright colored background is difficult for people to read, or could be difficult for people to read, and there are different ratios depending on the size of your text, and there are also tools that you can actually use to check the color contrast in your documentation. There are color contrast checkers that you can use to check if this makes sense and if this will be okay or accessible enough for people to use. And then, this is repeated. The next is too many images and infographics not linked to the text. Remember, screen readers cannot pick images, cannot explain what is in your image. So only use images where necessary, and then make sure you try to, it's important to link those images in the text, explain what the image is doing there, relate it to the text. So when someone is, using other sources of input to access the text, they can understand, oh, there's an image here, this is what this image is, and this is what the image is doing. Too many navigation links. When you have too many navigation links in your document, it takes people out of the document and they can get confused. They can find it difficult to come back to where they are and things like that. Non-descriptive links, using links like click here, and things like that. It's not clear where that link is taking people to. So you need to use descriptive links. You need to use descriptions that are descriptive enough for your links. So when they hover over it or when they're listening to it, they understand that when I click this link, this is where it's taking me to. Inaccurate heading structures. This is also really important when you're organizing documents. You have H4 header, H2 header. It's difficult to understand how the content is organized, what is under what is explaining what, is this a section, and things like that, which is difficult for people with different abilities to access. And then disorganized content. It's important that you maintain a good flow in your documentation. Remember, we talked about people with cognitive, disabilities and things like that who find it difficult to concentrate, or people with dyslexia and things like that. So when your content is disorganized, they find it hard to assimilate, understand, and be able to pick up what you're trying to explain. And then some of these things might look like really minute, something like an alt text and all, but accessible documentation is still hard for a lot of open source communities to adopt. And these are not the only reasons, but these are some of the major reasons. The first is lack of knowledge. A lot of open source contributors don't understand how important these things are in your documentation, and they feel like it's just an add-on. They don't really understand the importance of putting all these things in place. They feel like, oh, the open source organization just wants us to do it. And then when you have that kind of ideology, there's a tendency for you to forget or miss out on those things. But it's very important that open source communities begin to sensitize their contributors on the importance of, having all these things. Lack of resources. There are no resources within open source communities on accessible documentation, things that people can go through to understand what accessible documentation is, how they can incorporate it when they are working on documentation, when they are contributing to the project, and things like that. And then you have lack of clear guidance and standards also. Talking about it, raising awareness is not enough. To maintain consistency across, all open source community have lots of contributors. You have different people coming into the project every day, contribute to your project, drop out tomorrow, someone else is coming in. So you need to establish clear guidelines somewhere that anybody that wants to contribute, anybody that wants to participate can, be able to access these guidelines and understand, what accessible documentation is and how to create it, and also imbibe it when they are contributing to your project. And then lastly, have complexity of technical content. So because of how complex some technical content are, how complex whatever product or open source product you're working on is, it might be difficult for, technical writers or people contributing to the project to break down this concept into like simple, concise, language that anybody can read and understand without having to pick a dictionary up or figure it out. But then there are ways to go about this. There are things that you can put in place to be able to overcome these challenges. So as I mentioned, use clear headings, subheadings, provide alternative text, use clear and simple language. This is really important because I've had conversations with people when you say, oh, you're a technical writer, and you're like, oh, big grammar. You have to know big grammar for you to be able to be a technical writer. And I'm like, it's actually the exact opposite. As a technical writer, you are not trying to write big grammar. Tech is already complex as it is. You are trying to simplify it. So using big grammar is only going to make things more complicated. So you need to always have it at the back of your mind to make text clear, simple. Instead of using things like utilize, use. Everybody knows what use is. You understand? Simple languages that people read, and then it's easy for them to assimilate without reading 1, 2, 3, 4 times before they understand, what you're trying to say and all that. And then well-written text that supports any included infographics. I mentioned this. If you're including graphics, it's very, very important. A lot of people feel like, yeah, when they include so many images, it makes the document look nice and things like that. But there are a lot of things attached to using images in your documentation. So it shouldn't be too much. It should only be used where it is necessary. There's no point in including an image that is repeating what is already in the text, or using image in place of text, because text would always be better. People might want to translate, they might want to listen to it, and so many other things that image doesn't provide. So, and if for any reason you feel, oh, it's important to include images, infographics in your content, link it to the text, explain it properly, so it can apply to everyone. And then keyboard shortcuts. I mentioned people with impairments, disabilities, or, things like that. So they might be using just keyboards. Can your documents be accessed with only keyboards? Do I have to use my mouse to scroll before it works? Do I have to use my mouse and things like that? It shouldn't be limited to one output device. So you should be able to incorporate all this when you're working on your documentation and also test for it. Using interactive tables. When you're using tables, include table headers, captions to explain, what the table is talking about. The header should clearly, depict what is in those rows or columns. So, as I mentioned, people can, easily, in any format, understand what is in the document. So now, how can we overcome accessibility barriers in open source documentation? So the first thing is awareness. It's very, very important that open source community begin to talk more about accessible documentation. I believe that contributors are really not aware of how important some of these things are, because when you have conversation with people about documentation, it's mostly, even for organizations that have good documentation, most times it's just about style guides. We have style guides. We want to make the documentation consistent. We want to make the documentation okay, easy, but you don't hear people talking about accessibility. Like, we need to make our documentation accessible to diverse audience. You don't hear them talking about people with disabilities. You don't hear them talking about, putting all those things in the conversation when they are talking about documentation. So the first step is being aware, and this starts by having those conversations with your community involved. Everybody should be aware of these things and have it in mind when they are working on documentation. Establish guidelines, I've talked about this. Conduct accessibility audits. So it's not all about just creating the guidelines, talking about it. Are you checking if these guidelines are being followed? Are you doing audits? Are you carrying out checks on your documentation using this? What's your documentation review process like? Do you have processes in place to ensure that some of these things are not missed when you're working on documentation? And then you have user testing. No matter how good you feel your documentation might be, remember, most times you're not writing it for yourselves, you're writing it for different people. So if you are considering this diverse audience, these people with abilities when you're working on your documentation, you should be able to conduct user testing with this set of people. Because, for someone like me who I can see, even if I close my eyes and try to, it can be like someone who actually has like a visual impairment or maybe low vision, actually testing the documentation and telling you these are the issues I'm having, or this is fine and all that. So we need to find ways to incorporate things like this in our documentation workflows. Optimize documentation for different devices. This is really important. I know it seems basic, but I know how many documentations I've opened on my mobile and I had to close it because I couldn't use it on mobile. It was, the whole experience was terrible. So it's very important when you're creating your documentation, test it on different platforms, test it on different devices to make sure it's optimized. And then feedback loop. A lot of organizations says yes, or open source projects says yes, we take feedbacks. Do you actually work on this feedback? Do you actually incorporate these feedbacks into your documentation? So it's very important that you have like an ongoing cycle to be able to utilize the feedbacks that you get from community. It's not a one-time thing, it's not a two-time thing, it's something that is regular, because as we know, the tech space is evolving every day. We're also growing every day, bringing in new products. So as you're creating new documentation, more documentation, it's very important that you incorporate user feedback into that cycle. And now, we're gradually going to the end. So these are a few success stories from open source projects that have actually like really worked on accessibility. Razorpay recorded an increase in the number of users, the meaning they began to start thinking of accessibility and working on accessible documentation. Jenkins, an organization that is close to my heart and I also contribute to, recorded 40% increase in project contributions when they started to work on improving their documentation and making it more accessible. And then Wikimedia also recorded 50% increase in user satisfaction when they started to, think or work on making their documentation more accessible. So I think from this number, we can see how really important it is and how impactful, because we have a lot of people around us that are living with different types of abilities or disabilities, even beyond the list that I have here. And it's very, very important. Like, I mean, if you're able to incorporate all these people, there's no way you're going. And even outside of people with abilities, even we that feel, oh, we are fine and everything, when you work on documentation with accessibility in mind, it improves the documentation in every way for all your users. You have better documentation, you have increased user satisfaction, better user experience, even in using your product, not just the documentation. Because I mean, the end goal of the documentation is for people to be able to use whatever product or whatever it is you're writing about. So you have increased users, increased contributors. Even people, contributors from diverse backgrounds can contribute to your project when your documentation is written that way. It's not only product documentation, even your contribution guidelines, things that can encourage people to get more involved in your project. All these are also types of documentation that needs to be accessible. And then this is the last slide, just to summarize some of the things that I've said, do's and don'ts. So use simple colors, don't use bright contrasting colors that makes it hard to read. Write in plain English, don't use figure of speech and idioms and assume that everybody will understand all those things simply because you do. Use simple sentences and bullets. Don't create a wall of text. The fact that you're writing documentation doesn't mean it should be scary when people come and they're just seeing like a whole block of text and they're like, where do I start from? Sometimes people just want to skim through your document and be able to pick out important information easily. Having a whole wall of text is going to make this really difficult. And then make buttons, make links descriptive. Avoid things like click here, touch here, things that are not descriptive enough, and then build simple and consistent layouts. I know sometimes when we're trying to focus on making the document look good, you want to have like different layouts, a box here, another box there, things like that. It might look beautiful at the end of the day, but is this really usable? Is this really accessible? If someone is reading, will they understand the flow of the document with the different boxes that you have in your documentation and all that? So with this being said, I think this is everything that I wanted to share. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.